We had presentations this morning on thinking about both the Habsburg terrain from Professor Suppan and thinking also about the Ottoman terrain from Professor McMeekin. And my presentation is going to put those two pieces together a little bit. It's connected to a book that I've just finished writing that will come out next year, just 1 year too late for the 1919 centennial, which is about Woodrow Wilson and the reimagining of Eastern Europe. And it's about reimagining Eastern Europe on the terrain of those two displaced empires. What I want to talk about a little bit is the ways in which Wilson's ideas about one empire shapes his ideas about the other, and the ways in which he thinks reciprocally about those two empires as his ideas develop. I should say about Wilson as someone who thinks about Eastern Europe is that he really doesn't think about it much until America goes to war in 1917. He's not knowledgeable about Eastern Europe, and he sets himself to learning quickly as much as he can. I would say there's probably never been an American president who was as interested in Eastern Europe as Woodrow Wilson was, but that interest is pretty focused on the years between 1917 and 1919. So the first piece of this story, right, if we were to think about Wilson's older interest in Eastern Europe, is it kind of starts with the Ottoman Empire. We know that Wilson, as a Princeton University student in the 1870s, was following the Eastern Crisis of the 1870s. The Eastern Crisis, which brings Russia and the Ottoman Empire into conflict and sets up a very important division in British politics over the question of whether or not to support the Ottoman Empire, a division between Disraeli and Gladstone, whom you see caricatured there on the cover of Seton Watson's famous book. And Wilson is a Gladstonian. Gladstone believes that the Ottoman Empire needs to be removed from Europe. It's a point of Christian liberal ideology for Gladstone to believe that the Ottoman Empire must be removed at all costs. And we can see that Wilson in the 1870s is already an enthusiast. And by the time we get to the next generation, one generation later, this is the one small piece of ideological baggage connected to the region that he brings with him to the next generation. December 1912, just after Wilson's been elected president, there's this flip comment in which Wilson replied, "There ain't going to be no Turkey," right, in the aftermath of his election. As if this is something that's in the back of his mind, the idea of the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire. Wilson, by the way, even later in the day is capable of making very flippant comments about Turkey, and in 1919 is in public speeches announcing that we won't be talking about Turkey today. We can wait for Thanksgiving to do that. So there's a sort of ongoing jokiness that you see here already in 1912 when Wilson speaks about the Ottoman Empire. January 1917, before America goes to war, we thought that since Germany and Russia had agreed to free Poland, that should be put in, right? We're thinking about peace terms here. We naturally agreed upon Belgium and Serbia being restored. Alsace and Lorraine, we were not quite certain of, but we agreed that Turkey should cease to exist in January of 1917. And then in August of 1917, after America has gone to war against Germany, we already have a little bit of an ideological formulation of what Turkey is ethnographically, a mass of different races, a veritable hornet's nest, which keeps Europe always in alarm. Right, this is an evolution within the Gladstonian framework towards what we would think of a Wilsonian view of empire based on, in this case, right, thinking about what it would mean to clarify it racially or nationally. Colonel House's diary from October, we spoke of the Italian campaign and the campaign in Asia Minor and the partition or non-partition of Turkey. He, Wilson, thought he should say that Turkey should become effaced and that the disposition of it should be left to the peace conference. Goes on, and House adds that he thinks that it would be advisable to say that Turkey must become autonomous in its several parts according to racial lines, and he accepted this addenda. So this is interesting, the evolution towards the idea that Turkey should become autonomous in its several parts according to racial lines. And again, it's going to become part of the Wilsonian agenda at the peace conference, and it's going to become the point of contact for Wilson in trying to align the way that he feels about the Ottoman Empire with the way that he feels about the Habsburg monarchy as the war moves towards its conclusion. In December 4th, 1917, in Wilson's State of the Union speech, 3 days before the declaration of war on Austria-Hungary, he's still saying, "We do not wish in any way to impair or to rearrange the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is no affair of ours what they do with their own life, either industrially or politically." What I want to emphasize is that for Wilson, right, the idea of transforming the Ottoman Empire is much older and much more deeply built in than any innate convictions about what should happen to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. On the other hand, we shall hope to secure for the peoples of the Balkan Peninsula and for the people of the Turkish Empire the right and opportunity to make their own lives safe, their own fortunes secure against oppression or injustice, and from the dictation of foreign courts or parties. So, very different perspectives on Austria-Hungary and on the Ottoman Empire, but what you're looking at there down below, the lower quotation on the Ottoman Empire, is going to become almost verbatim Wilson's position on Austria-Hungary, right, within the year. The peace must deliver the peoples of Austria-Hungary, the peoples of the Balkans, and the peoples of Turkey, alike in Europe and in Asia, from the impudent and alien dominion of the Prussian military and commercial autocracy. Right, same State of the Union speech. It's maybe the first time we see him lining up Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire in the same sentence, both of them involving peoples who need to be delivered, although for the moment, weirdly, they need to be delivered from Prussian autocracy, right, not from imperial rule by their own sovereigns, from within their own empires. But here we see them lined up, and then famously in the 14 points. In point 10 and point 12, suddenly we see the correspondence emerge pretty clearly for Wilson. For point 10 on the peoples of Austria-Hungary, I've bold-faced it, the freest opportunity of autonomous development. Point 12, the Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire, an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development for the other nationalities, non-Turkish. Right, we've gone from, over the space of really just a month since the State of the Union speech, in which his perspectives on them are completely divergent, to a point in the 14 points where he has them completely aligned, and he now has an ideological formula for thinking about both empires in relation to the possibilities of autonomous development. Autonomous, what does it mean, right? As Walter Lippmann later mentions in the inquiry memorandum, same difficulty arises as in the case of Austria-Hungary concerning the word autonomous. We were just talking about that before with reference to Kurdistan. I do want to, just before moving forward, emphasize for you again the ambiguity of the 14 points in terms of its commitment by focusing on the comma following the peoples of Austria-Hungary. I don't know whether you've done this before with the 14 points, but the comma makes it very ambiguous because it's not clear whether it's Austria-Hungary whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded, which would be a commitment to preserving the monarchy, or whether it's the peoples whose place among the nations we wish to see safeguarded, which would promote the peoples of Austria-Hungary to the same level of the peoples of nation-states elsewhere in Europe, right? Totally different political message, depending on how you interpret the significance of the comma and the relation of the clause, and it's something that was noted at the time. Wilson's speech to Congress, February 11th, 1918. This is the gloss on the 14 points. It's the famous four principles speeches in which he moves beyond autonomy to speak of national aspirations and self-determination, which never comes up in the 14 points. National aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase, it is an imperative principle of action. All well-defined national aspirations shall be accorded the utmost satisfaction that can be accorded them without introducing new or perpetuating old elements of discord and antagonism. That's a tough condition, of course, as Wilson will discover himself. But here he's moved beyond the idea of autonomous development to a principle of satisfying national aspirations, indeed, to the utmost satisfaction. And in the same speech of February 11th, he gives the war a new and very special characterization. He speaks of it as this war of emancipation, emancipation from the threat and attempted mastery of selfish groups of autocratic rulers, right? This is, on the one hand, putting in place the ideology that will be applied to the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires, right, as those autocratic rulers, but it also makes an implicit connection to American history that's interesting ideologically for Wilson, right? It connects it back to the American Civil War as a war of emancipation, famously in American rhetoric and ideology. The years in which of the years of the Wilson presidency are the years that the Lincoln Memorial is being constructed in Washington. Wilson would have been very aware of the Lincoln Memorial. Wilson has a very complicated relation to the American Civil War. He grows up as a child in Virginia, as a child of the Confederacy, the losing side in the American Civil War. And the characterization of World War I as a war of emancipation places the struggle in World War I in rhetorical alignment with Lincoln's struggle in the Civil War. The War of Emancipation, though, will raise the question of emancipation from what and from whom. And that's where this formulation will become relevant for thinking about the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. Where now the war is over, Wilson is speechifying the liberated peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and of the Turkish Empire call out to us for this thing, the League, in this case. Here, perfectly aligns, right? Liberated peoples of the two empires. The nations that have long been under the heel of the Austrian, that have long cowered before the German, that have long suffered the indescribable agonies of being governed by the Turk, have called out to the world generation after generation for justice, for liberation, and for succor. Right? Here's where he gives the idea of the war of emancipation a particular meaning with respect to those empires. Wilson, in March 1919, in the Council of Four, gives an interesting comparison of the two empires, which gives us a little bit of a sense of how he's thinking about their disappearance. The Ottoman Empire, he says, is in a state of dissolution as though it were made of quicksilver, whereas the Habsburg Empire is in a state of disintegration and has been broken into pieces. So the Habsburg Empire broken into pieces, right? Those pieces can be used to form nationally coherent successor states. But the Ottoman Empire, more problematic, there's an ethnographic map that he has at hand, right, seems to be liquidly soluble. Because its national components are so mixed. There are no usable fragments for the Ottoman Empire, and it's one of the things that will make him sympathetic to a mandate solution for thinking about the Ottoman Empire. The Turkish Empire, moreover, had fallen apart, as the Austro-Hungarian had. It had never had any real unity. It had been held together only by pitiless, inhuman force. Its people cried aloud for release, for succor, from unspeakable distress, for all that the new dawn of hope seemed at last to bring within its dawn. Peoples hitherto in utter darkness were to be led out into the same light and given at last a helping hand. Again, the two empires now aligned so that you can speak about them together. I wanted to say a word about something that Sean already brought up this morning, which was the Wilsonian notion of an American mandate in Armenia and in Constantinople. It comes up almost immediately in December of 1918. It's one of the weird counterfactuals of post-war history to try to imagine what that would have been like an American mandate in Armenia or in Constantinople and at the Straits, to say nothing of both. But already in December 1918, when Wilson is in London, before the treaty convenes, Mr. Lloyd George informed the Imperial War Cabinet that President Wilson expressed himself in favor of the Turks being cleared out of Europe altogether. That's almost a quotation from Gladstone's pamphlet from 1876. But of their place at Constantinople being taken by some small power acting as a mandatory of the League of Nations, Mr. Balfour had told the President that the Eastern Committee had been in favor of the United States acting as mandatory at Constantinople. That's not in Gladstone's pamphlet, but clearly would interest Wilson, who has adolescent Gladstonian fantasies, the point at which this lecture began. With regard to this, President Wilson pointed out that the United States were extremely proud of their disinterested position in this war and did not wish to be deprived of that pride. It would be difficult to persuade them that such a mandate was not a profit, but really a burden. That is to say, Wilson can only do it if it's clearly disinterested. The British regard this as prissy posturing. There's the cartoon that appears in Punch in May 1919 of Wilson as an odalisque in the Sultan's harem, making the great renunciation of Constantinople. It says down below, "No, I don't think it quite suits my austere type of beauty." I don't know if you can read the text. I can only barely read it on my screen. But I think it's probably not to be understood simply as vain posturing. I think Wilson is actually truly mixed and ambivalent about this. For his part, he says in the Council of War, he was quite disinterested, since the United States of America did not want anything in Turkey. They would be only too delighted if France and Great Britain would undertake the responsibility. Lately, however, it had been put to him that he must approach his own people on this matter, and he intended to try, although it would mean some very good talking on his part. He admitted that the United States of America must take the responsibilities as well as the benefits of the League of Nations. You can see he's tempted. Nevertheless, there was great antipathy in the United States of America to the assumption of these responsibilities. Even the Philippines were regarded as something hot in the hand that they would like to drop. Wilson says, "I'm told that the Turks wish that the regions inhabited by their race not be divided, and also that there is a movement among them in favor of an American administration." Lloyd George says, "That would not surprise me. Of all Westerners, the Americans are those against whom they have the fewest grievances." Wilson says, "I have no hope that American opinion will consent to it. Hatred of the Turk is unbelievable in America. What American opinion will approve is the protection of the Armenians or of some population which stands against the Turks. It will also approve the occupation of Constantinople if it is conferred on us, because in that way Constantinople will be taken away from the Turks." So it's Wilson manipulating a certain popular Turkophobia that he assumes and that he also clearly shares. Although Wilson's own determination not to seem interested in participating in any sort of occupation of Turkey has him by the end of 1919 declaring that he will withdraw the French treaty rather than consent to see the Turkish Empire divided as spoils. Meaning that he himself would also not want to participate in the despoliation of the Turkish Empire, as he sees both the Greeks and Italians eager to do. That is to say, Wilson's sense of ambivalence about an American role in the post-Ottoman world, which will carry over into his perspective on the post-Habsburg world, leads him to articulate a sense of what his principles are regarding a post-imperial Eastern Europe. I want you to note that although he does not believe that any part of the empire, or of either empire, should be seized as spoils, he has a very clear sense of what it means for the conference itself to operate on Eastern Europe. We are carving a piece of Poland out of Germany's side. We are creating an independent Bohemia below that, an independent Hungary below that, and enlarging Romania. And we are rearranging the territorial division of the Balkan states, he says in a speech back at the White House when he is visiting in late February and the beginning of March. I want you to notice two things about this. One, of course, is the wild, crazy presumption of the way the first-person plural and the active verbs are being used to describe the role of the peacemakers in carrying out operations on the map of Europe. But the other thing I want you to notice about it that I think is really interesting is that he's actually drawing a map for people who actually can't clearly envision Eastern Europe, right? Poland out of Germany's side on the top, Bohemia below that, independent Hungary below that, and then Romania, right, and the Balkan states. What I'm interested in is the way that the map appears in Wilson's head, the way he keeps a map of Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, in his head, performs mental operations upon it, and conveys those to the public. Here's a map from the period that shows the pieces in play. For Wilson, it's a puzzle, right? To try to rearrange the pieces, right, in a way that will make sense, will fit together like a puzzle. They have to be interlocking. And the thing about the foundational moment, the Stunde Null, is that if you get all the puzzle pieces right at the right moment, then you can create a stable Europe for the future, is his conviction and the conviction of the peacemakers. Again, and south of Poland is Bohemia, which we cut away from the Austrian combination. And below Bohemia is Hungary, which can no longer rely upon the assistance strength of Austria. And below her is an enlarged Romania. Alongside of Romania is the new Slavic kingdom, right? He's drawing a map at the same time that he's actually participating in the remapping of Europe. So the last piece of this talk is about the map that emerges in 1919, the Wilsonian map of Eastern Europe, in which the empires are displaced, and a new map of national states emerges, which is kind of recognizably our map of Eastern Europe to this day, with some major adjustments. What I wanted to do was compare it for a moment to the post-1989 map of Eastern Europe. I've just come from a conference in Berlin where we were talking about the 30th anniversary of 1989, of course. And one of the things that's interesting for me, thinking about the 30th anniversary of 1989, at the same time that we're thinking about the 100th anniversary of 1919, is to think about the ways in which post-1989 Eastern Europe echoes post-1919 Eastern Europe. That is to say, if you look at the lower map on the left, you're looking at a map of Eastern Europe as a part of the Soviet Empire, in which it's colored red to go with the Soviet Union. And then if you look at a map post-1989, indeed post-1993, what you're looking at is a map that is articulated again, in which countries have returned to the map. Countries which were on the map all along, but shaded red during the Cold War. When Wilson is thinking about national sovereignty, the rhetoric of 1989 closely follows the idea that sovereignty is being restored to the Eastern European countries, which in that sense are being placed back upon a Wilsonian map as they are, quote unquote, emancipated from Soviet-style communism. That's Churchill on the upper left, who I'm giving you as a sort of someone who's inherited some of the Wilsonian legacy. Here's Wilson in 1919. The heart and center of this treaty is that it sets at liberty people all over Europe and in Asia who have hitherto been enslaved by powers which were not their rightful sovereigns and masters, enslaved peoples who ought to be freed. I want to suggest to you that that's actually remarkably well adapted in American Cold War ideology. It's how we talked about Eastern Europe during the Cold War as well. And if we can think about the 1919 map then in relation to the post-1989 map, and we can think about the alignment of rhetorical ideology as well. There's the quote from Wilson that I just read you from San Diego in 1919. Below it is Ronald Reagan in 1964. While we engage in a conspiracy of silence and never open our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in the Soviet colonies in the satellite nations, 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain. The language of enslavement and emancipation that Wilson introduces into the discussion of the 1919 settlement fully at home in American Cold War rhetoric concerning the very same part of the world that Wilson was speaking about in 1919. I promised that we would talk about Brzezinski just for a moment. You can see that Brzezinski, in the winter of 1989, 1990, is speaking about the progressing self-emancipation of the East European nations. A Cold Warrior who is also able to adapt what we tend to think of as a Wilsonian rhetoric. Wilson, of course, was the hero in Eastern Europe, the hero of the settlement of 1919. That's the statue that was erected to him in the Prague station, in front of the Prague train station in 1928. Wilson's statues are controversial in the United States now, and Wilson's name is controversial because of the role that his administration played in segregation in the United States. Wilson's statues in Eastern Europe were all taken down in 1939 as the Nazis occupied different parts of Eastern Europe, and they stayed down during the Stalinist period. However, they come back after 1989. 1989 is going to become a Wilsonian moment again. These are the older statues. What you're looking at there are Prague, Wilson Square in Zagreb, and the Gutzon Borglum statue of Wilson in Poznan that was erected in 1931. He's the guy who sculpted Mount Rushmore. He also did Wilson for Eastern Europe. It comes back, the Wilson statue at the Prague train station after 1989. It's up there again today in 2011, as if marking the recreation of the post-Cold War geopolitical order as a Wilsonian moment in 2011. It comes back together simultaneously with the statue of Ronald Reagan in Warsaw in 2011, because 2011 is not a Wilson year, it's a Reagan year. It's the centennial of Ronald Reagan, who was born in 1911. So curiously, we see Wilson returning to preside over the post-1989 settlement in tandem with Ronald Reagan, whose statues are arising, again, all over Eastern Europe at exactly the same moment. Again, I would say that Wilson, among American presidents, right, no one has ever been more interested in Eastern Europe than Wilson was between 1917 and 1919. For me, the curiosity about Wilson's interest, and maybe the thing that makes it most interesting, is he never laid eyes on Eastern Europe, right? Never set foot in Eastern Europe. His relation to Eastern Europe is entirely platonic. And that makes it, for me, all the more interesting to think about the roles that he plays in the remapping of the region. Thank you.